I've known Ty for many years. We went to school together at University of Toronto, and he's always been, charting a unusual path that's been tied to research and to excellence in his work. So he's been working lately at the intersection of architecture and neuroscience, something that I believe more architects and designers should be thinking about. He's a world-recognized pioneer who's making significant contributions to health and humanity through the medium of architecture. With award-winning projects around the globe that enact salutogenic design, designed that actively incites health, he's the first Canadian architect to have earned a Master of Neuroscience applied to architecture, and has a Master as well of Architecture and Urban Design from Harvard University, and a Bachelor of Architecture from U of T. So it's my great pleasure to have him speak about how he's been applying mass timber, I think since the start of his career, even before mass timber was very popular, and I think also in collaboration with his father, who was an architect, who was also obsessed around mass timber, and how he's been really using it for purposes of health and well-being. Ty.
I want to explore with you today the relationship with what we build and how it can actively cause health, and really begin to understand how we can use the built environment to act as an accelerant for optimal health for everything that we do. And if we're going to explore that, we probably need to begin to explore a little bit around the idea of what causes health, and also get further into the idea of how we define health and well-being, because both of those words are thrown around extensively in the vocabularies that we hear, but we need to dig a little bit further into that, and I'll define what I believe that means to me from the work we've been doing. I want to frame it also in the context of the work that we've been doing. We started using mass timber about 25 years or so ago in a very complex hospital in the north of Canada. But why did we use mass timber? The reason was because the community's economy was dialed in around forestry and pulp and paper, and the building should begin to respect that or reflect that. We then moved into a very and that first project, the building codes wouldn't allow it. This project, we needed to bring in a sprinkler system, fire suppression system from Europe to get a mass timber project approved for a cancer center. But why were we using mass timber? Because we could use it as an expressive way to communicate something to the people that were coming to heal and the people that were working in these complex healthcare buildings. We then shifted in to begin to understand how the data and the evidence supports that the role of wood can enhance empathy, learning, memory for kids that are working in healthcare environments, and equally enhance the retention and a variety of other things for the teachers in that space. We then moved into looking at mass timber to use it in hospitality, in this treehouse resort, then moving on about 7 years ago to figure out what's the optimal height for a mass timber building, fairly straightforward in the way it's done. This is in London, England, for a building that was 44 stories. David Moses was the engineer on that work. This is some more of the recent work we've been involved with. This is an education facility. The way that you arrange the geometry and the type of material, it begins to enhance cognition and memory for students in education facilities. Another one that's similar to that. This is the largest mass timber project in the Middle East. It's a cancer center in Jerusalem on one of the most important streets in the country, working with a fabricator out of Austria. And this is some of the projects that we're involved with right now, education buildings that begin to look at cognizance and how the architecture can enhance creativity as a result of how you build and what you build. And some projects that are coming forward, this is another one with Element 5 for seniors housing, and some that are in the pipeline. But let's begin to explore this idea about the relationship of how we build and what it does. So we hear a lot about, we've talked a lot about high performance buildings. What I'm interested in is human performance. The relationship of what we build and what that does to enhance our ability to thrive and flourish. And the evidence of it, we'll get into that a little further, but this idea of the environment has the ability to stimulate memory, empathy, emotion, social interaction, places you want to stay and spend time together to deal with a lot of the challenging issues that we're dealing with, which ties back to this idea of activating optimal health as a result of how and what we build. And connecting the dots in the office, we are laser focused on what are we making, what's the relationship to our mind health as a result of the environment, and what that does to enhance human performance of the people that are occupying these places. So the question is, what is design's role in beginning to activate it? What we do on a daily basis. And so with that, anybody recognize this fine-looking gentleman? Give you a hint. He's the guy that designed this place. Getting warmer? Frederick Law Olmsted. Frederick Law Olmsted, as you know, or as we know, is commonly known, is referred to as the father of landscape architecture. The curious thing for me that isn't very well known is that's not what his job was. He was the founder and the director of the United States Sanitary Commission, which in fact was the beginning of the Red Cross. He wasn't a landscape architect. What he was doing was using the medium of design to activate optimal health. And so these fantastic parks that we occupy, what did he call them? Sanitary institutions. Curious. Because what he figured was that he could use these things as an accelerant for something. The ability to use it to accelerate ecological health, physical health, societal health, mind health as a result of what he created. So this idea of the direct line and the intersection between design, what we create, and its ability to cause something. Certainly, we know very well that the things we design have a significant effect, either positive or negative, on ecological health. And clearly we know, and specifically coming out of COVID equally, that what we build has a significant impact on societal health. And clearly we know coming out of the mid-1900s, the proliferance of car-dominated and suburbs, is that, and these things, which we often hear about food deserts, they're not food deserts, they're food swamps that have a significant effect on human health and performance. And that's what leads into the next piece, which is this idea of mind health and the intersection, a new area that's developing, this intersection of neuroscience and architecture. Just before the pandemic, while running the practice, I went back and did a Master of Neuroscience applied to architecture and design at the University of Venice, first Canadian architect with that degree. What's it focused on? Back to this idea of placemaking, mind health, and human performance. And the analogy for that is optimal health is like a tabletop. And the four legs that support optimal health, the first leg is the relationship of what we design and what that does to ecological health. The second leg is physical health. The third leg is societal health, and the last one is back to mind health. If you take any one of those legs off, everything on the tabletop, optimal health, falls down and begins to break. But the question is, has our view of this changed over time? And what I'm going to do with you is blast through very, very quickly 5,000 years of our view of human history. For that 5,000 years, there was a very holistic and full view of the interaction of all of these things in the relationship of how it could activate optimal health. But in the last 100 years, it has shifted firmly into a pathogenic view, patho and genesis, the origins of disease. We have a lot of programs that are preventative health programs. That's crazy. We should have programs that do one thing, which is activate optimal health, or saludo and genesis health and the origins of. And so if we go back 5,000 years, traditional Chinese medicine, this whole intersection of cultivating harmony in one's life, if we look at the foundations of Aboriginal health, it was all of these intersecting circles of society and family and economic and ecological. If we look at Aristotle, this concept of eudaimonia, if you're not familiar with it, very interesting term, at least for me, of this idea of human flourishing. We move on to Hippocrates, seen as the father of medicine. It wasn't just about stopping bad things from happening, but it was looking at the holistic idea of the environment and what it does to activate health. The Romans and the aqueducts and the bath system. This period is interesting because all of these terms right now are coming back into the forefront of societal's view of how we should be doing things. And then we come to the epidemic, which is very similar to what we have just gone through and experienced. But that's when germ theory came along. That's when the basis of Western evidence medicine came along. And everything came to a screeching halt at this stage when the Fetzner report came out, and it was recommending to all of the leading medical schools. And it said, effectively, if it wasn't Western evidence-based medicine, it effectively was witchcraft. And all of our thinking for thousands and thousands of years is pitched out the door. This is also the period, very interesting, the prosperity in life, how long you would live. You're not going to die anymore from infectious diseases, at least at that period. It was around chronic diseases or lifestyle-related things. Equally, it was the time, the beginning of the ecological demise. The whole rise of chronic diseases that begins to become a tsunami that is expensive and washing over our society. But these things are called in medical terms a common source epidemic. But then we get into this period, and what happens? Phil Knight, who invented Nike, all of the shoes for all of the different things that we do. Jane Fonda, anybody remember Jane Fonda? Colorful spandex and exercise videos. I'm happy some people remember who she is. But this, again, was our rebirth on beginning to understand what health and well-being is. Antonovsky, if you don't know about salutogenesis, get your head into it. I think for me, he's a fascinating guy. And then we start moving into this time where we're beginning to reteach these things in a leading institution, governments investing in it. And in fact, all the smartphones and stuff that we have, big tech is moving into health for a whole number of reasons, not only being money. But this thing, planetary health, if you got into that, looking at all of the intersections, not just of ecological health, which we have a lot of focus on, and we are at a point in time now about accelerating optimal health as a currency that will allow us to prosper and flourish. Back to our friend again, our lovely gentleman, this idea of what's our role in activating health, this idea about the environment doing something, about stimulating memory, empathy, social interaction as a result of placemaking, mind health, and human performance. So let's deepen our understanding a little further about this idea of environmental enrichment. So environmental enrichment, the Canadian Donald Herb began to discover in the late 1940s that he took his little lab mice home and put them in environments that one would say are simulating, but not overstimulating. But what he discovered about the mice that were in this area is that they began to stimulate the connections, the synapses between the neurons as a result of the environment. They performed better on challenges, had less problems. And this goes on further to see that their synapses are growing at a rate of 25% compared to the guys that are in lab rats. If I came to you and said I could enhance the learning of your students in George Brown, or the performance of your people as a result of the environment at 25%, that's a reasonably significant increase as a result of it. This study is interesting also, that it had mice in two different spaces with a little connector between them. They fed them morphine, on the water thing. But the mice would gravitate over and forget the morphine when they were in this enriched environment, which for me is fascinating. The other side, which is a lot of environments, it seems that we inhabit, are impoverished environments. And in fact, they begin to damage the workings of the brain. The most extraordinary example of this went to the Supreme Court of the United States, and it found that these three guys, one specifically, spent all of 30 years, or I should say 29 years, every hour of the day except for 1 hour of the day. And what did it do? It damaged the hippocampus. The hippocampus is very important about emotional regulation, wayfinding, and all the rest. The environment did that, and that's why it was a very important Supreme Court, because it did physical damage to the occupants as a result of what was done. And because we are such a fantastic species, is that countries right now are using this type of torture. They take people, they put them in a white room, the light is continuous throughout the day, and just to put the icing on the top of it is they feed them everything that is white rice and everything else. And it severely damages these people, and they're effectively broken after about a 6 to 9 month period that is hard to come back from. Let's shift to the other side about the environmental enrichment side. And so every space that you walk in, when you walk through the threshold of that door, you have cognitive and precognitive reactions, and some that are conscious and some that are subconscious. But all of those things have physiological and psychological impacts to your body, the chemistry of your body as a result of the space that you're in. Let's go a little further into that, this neurodegeneration. Thankfully, that as you grow over, you can continue to form the neurons in your space, and these help you adapt and learn over time, and the environment has a significant impact on that. If we begin to go a little further from that, if we look at the environment, what does it do to the physiological aspects of your body and your mind? It changes your cortisol levels. Cortisol levels are very, very important as they relate to producing stress and anxiety. Big issue these days, we know. Your blood pressure, your heart rate, your heart health, all of that, depending on the environment, can be improved significantly. It helps your immune system, and certainly importantly increases memory and strengthens that neural network within your brain as a result of the environment. I'm not going to get into this. There's a whole range of things in here that are very important that we've gone into with a lot of depth. And this is scientific research that is beginning to quantify these things. If we want to get into a little further on it, is that if you look at wood as a material, what does it do, for example, in education environments? This whole idea of place attachment theory is very important. It's a whole thing about how you view yourself, very important certainly with younger people. If you get further into it, this idea that with students that it has the ability to enhance well-being, improves learning outputs, anxiety, and there's also the amount of wood that's in the environment that's really quite interesting. And then when you look at the staff side of it also, this idea of comfort, reduced heart rate, cardiac issues, reducing burnout, very important issue that we know these days. This is a whole bunch of stuff. If you look at healthcare environments, specifically long-term care environments, with using wood within the environments, stats are fantastic. If you look at the antimicrobial, if you look at sound, if you look at scent, what that does to reducing all of these metrics into a positive aspect. It's fascinating, at least for me. And then some of the other things that get down, we see a lot of environments, that have wood on the floor, on the ceiling, and all the rest. If you dive into the data, the sweet spot of the amount of wood, so it ties into something called positive ambiguity in your mind and perception and stimulation. It's somewhere around 30 to 50% as the ideal spot. And then if you look in long-term care areas, in fact, newborn babies, really interesting for me is that if there's wood within the environment, their ability to sleep better rises significantly compared to other environments that might have more artificial things. That is as a result of what and how we use to build. Got a full bibliography. This is just partial onto the data of it. But we need to begin to think of what we create as non-invasive therapeutic treatments. The environments we create where we heal, where we learn, where we play, and where we live. And they have a variety of different things, as we've seen, on what they can do to regenerate the thing that is up here. And beginning to think that this environment that we are in right now, it feeds us. And so what's the analogy for that? For me, it is that architecture is like food. It has the ability to stimulate and feed and enrich your mind, your body, the spiritual aspects, or it can do the exact opposite. And this idea that a lot of these spaces we create, they're full of empty calories, this idea that they cause dis-ease. I'm using that word very specifically, and certainly we know coming out of COVID, also about depression and boredom. There's a study out of the Polytechnic in Milan that studied people during COVID that had a balcony or didn't have a balcony, and what that did to performance, back to mental health. Obviously, the one with the balcony had significant input. But why is this important to the places that we design for people to learn, the places that we go and work and we don't see daylight, day in and out, the places we begin to heal? What is this you see on the screen? It is a hamburger, but for me, what it is, it's a metaphor for a lot of the places we create. They're transactional. The hamburger is fantastic. It's very functional. You don't need a plate. You don't need a knife and a fork. It does what it's asked for. It gives you protein. But arguably what it does is it leaves you worse off and feeling empty after an hour because of the sodium content and the other pieces of the puzzle that it begins to do damage to your body. This is a lot of the places that we're creating to live, to work, to heal, and to play. How many environments does this reflect? Is this the metaphor for the places that you work? Packed full of minerals and vitamins known as superfoods that do extraordinary things to nourish every part of your body and your mind. The question is, for me, is there the equivalent of what is known as architectural supervitamins that we can infuse into our environments? I'm going to blast through this fairly quickly, but this whole idea of how do we perceive our environments, I'll give you a little bit of tools in that area. So this lady, a Canadian, she's in the States, has developed this idea of constructive theory of emotion. And effectively what it says is that we have external spaces that we occupy, and we have internal places, which is perception up in your mind. We have inputs that come in through all of our senses, sight, smell, sound, all the rest. And with those things, we make predictions. You know, when you walk into a room, is it a place you want to stay, or is it somewhere that you want to run? The thing that's important about that perception, as we can imagine, is influenced by things we've learned, things we've experienced, or societal and cultural things that begin to tint that. What's a very simple example of that? Think of a little bumblebee. Do you see that bumblebee while you're walking up a meadow on a hill? You see it bouncing from flower to flower, or in the middle of a very busy city and you have a swarm of bees coming towards you. You have the sound of either the swarm of bees or this bee hitting you and stinging you, or you see it dancing from flower to flower. What happens then is those things that are learned or otherwise. Did you read about the killer bees that are coming into Canada? You know, are you, Matt, were you watching, you know, the little bumblebee on a cartoon? Are you desperately allergic to being stung by bees? Or are you a beekeeper? What happens is all of that filters through, is that a place that you want to stay or not? And clearly it's exactly the same in a city environment. There's inputs that come in, there's sounds, there's cobblestones, there's screeching tires. You smell, you know, is there benches to sit and all the rest? That ties into really, are these environments that we perceive are places we want to be and we want to stay? If you go a little further into it, and the research that we did through the University of Venice was that, which is interesting for me, is that the way we form person-to-place relationships, our environments, they're exactly the same way that we form person-to-person relationships. And so if you can think of spaces that are generous, or if I turn that around, think of a mentor that helped you, that just helped you because they wanted to. Think of an environment that's like that. Maybe it has a canopy that protects you from the rain, a place to sit, maybe some trees. All of those things tie together. And if you dive deeper into that, into our emotions, this is a symbol of all the emotions that we have. There's two primary axes that are tied to it, which is valiance on one side, goes from displeasure to pleasure. And then if you go from the bottom up to the top, it's the intensity from your groggy down below or ecstatic on the top. If we focus on the positive side of that, and if we get into the depth of the therapeutic output studies that have happened on what develops on enriched relationships, person to person, the qualities of those are feeling emotionally self, a sense of coherence. And if you look at really how they're being described on that sort of emotional level, they run into a variety of things about this generosity, a sense of occurrence, relationships that are natural and warm, this idea of variety and vitality, our ability to activate our own resources, and then the last one, which I think is the last couple, authenticity. We know relationships that are authentic. We certainly know relationships that are quite the opposite. This last one about relationships that are warm and silent and trusting. Curiously, when you take that further and you begin to look how that translates into the person-to-place relationships, in fact, the qualities and the characteristics are very, very similar. Back to this idea of places that are generous and warm, that you feel engaged and stimulated. Hopefulness is not optimism. Hope is actually a medical treatment with the oncologists. We're working in Jerusalem. It's in Lancet, it's been written up that in fact, if you can infuse hopefulness within, it increases improvements, specifically in cancer, Nature, we hear a lot about biophilia. It dives also beyond just natural plants, gets into natural shapes, natural materials, natural light, and this whole idea of fractal dimensional complexity. Some really interesting work on that, on how that begins to stimulate the mind and enhance performance. And then this other thing, clearly, as we understand this idea of an unplugged architecture that we can begin to hear ourselves and sense ourselves. Let's jump into very quickly a couple examples of these, of our work. I'm going to blast through it very, very quickly. But if we start on this idea of environments that are generous. And so this is a school that we've been involved with, but this idea that spaces that offer more than they're asked. And this isn't about giving more necessarily, but in fact, it might also be allowing you to do more. And generosity also relates to the design process, a bit of which we touched on before. But this idea of a higher purpose, or radiating this idea of a higher purpose. This is a school that we started with, a fantastic parking lot. I'm not sure exactly where the front door is. I'm trying to sort that out, which begins to be a little bit of a challenge. You can see the building at the top, the Crescent building in front of it, but which wasn't in the program. There's a garden, a semicircular garden that separates the parking lot to the curved building that basically embraces you. It's set back from the existing building, which creates another garden that was very well used, certainly throughout COVID specifically. The shape of the building, you'll see, there's an arch that's involved in it. Why are we using an arch? The arch does a lot of things actually to the mind and perception and consciousness. But a lot of the solutions we're seeing right now, there's a lot of complications that are being used to create big spans. Interestingly, the arch, in fact, is one of the most efficient things. And so we looked at probably a half dozen different variations on how we could do this. This was the most cost effective, but in fact, it works very well tied back to the idea of mind and stimulation. So leaving the parking lot, going through the garden, the path you follow is curved because it changes your perspective. Moving then into the building itself, the arches you can see the sub-branches that come off them. Why were they used? Again, between the curve and the triangles, they create this positive ambiguity, but also they reduce the span and make a much more efficient and cost-effective wood structure as a result of it. This idea of it also being able to catch the light, the shadows, the changing sense of day, which helps on perception and stimulation. We then move into this idea of hope and being able to communicate this idea of a sense forward, a sense of coherence. If you wake up in the morning, you don't have a sense of coherence or a sense of purpose, you don't get out of bed. So the question is, what's the role that architecture plays within that role? This is a cancer center in Jerusalem. It just opened recently. We were working with VHOG, which is an Austrian fabricator. In fact, that's been in business 30 years longer than the age of Canada. An interesting group to begin to work with. But again, the architecture is trying to communicate something. This is a cancer center. It's asymmetrical in its shape. It's been they've begun to call it the butterfly. It looks more fragile as opposed to sticking its chest out to you, but it's a very moody building. What it's trying to do is communicate messages of hope or transformation, or like a caterpillar that goes through a transformation from a caterpillar to a butterfly, or a butterfly is a symbol of hope because it represents the beauty of life, but also, in fact, the fragility of it as an important message, communicating that to people that are coming in and using the building. The entire scheme is really driven around the idea of daylight, and so daylight and gardens. So it's sort of like a courtyard house typology, typical to the area, but there's gardens on all levels. The lowest level is a garden that when you walk out of the radiation treatment bunker, what do you see? You see a garden that's a couple thousand square feet taking up floor area. Cascades up, daylight coming in from above, specifically down to the radiation treatment. Most radiation treatment places have zero daylight. It's like being in a submarine, which isn't good for staff or otherwise. But using daylight as as a stimulate for accelerating optimal health. So this is when you walk out of a radiation treatment area, back to the ideas of nature. You have natural light, you have natural plants, you have natural materials, and the whole vocabulary of the architecture is stretching and growing upwards to communicate a specific message while you're on a journey of this treatment or beginning to work there. And nature, again, a whole variety of aspects. It's not just biophilia. These fractal patterns are very important. This was trying to create something that looked like a tree-lined garden. We had to bring in a sprinkler system that didn't exist, a fog system to enable the structure to be created. Natural materials, natural shapes, nature itself, and natural light and pattern as a driver to communicate messages, tying back to enhancing human performance as the space as an accelerator, and then beginning to use this idea of variety and vitality. We were talking about repetitive classrooms just a little bit earlier. You know, what we do is, like probably all of us went through, these places that were cells and bells. In fact, they don't work particularly well for human performance. And so to be able to use this mass timber exoskeletal structure that has dissonance, it has this mix of lines that are straight and curves that are used to enhance curiosity with the changing lights and the view from when you're inside the building or when you're looking out for, this is middle school kids. And then the last one I just want to touch on, we know we've come through a very difficult time. We have a very big problem in society right now. All of the medical staff, the nurses, for example, they're in their prime at their 50s. They're all retiring right now, and there isn't the people to backfill it. The doctors are exiting in a massive way. There's a significant lack of trust between the medical workers because we told them, we banged on our pots and pans and told them how great they were, but we put them and their family clearly at risk. And so this idea of being able to create this unplugged architecture, specifically spaces that enhance the performance of medical staff, as well as the people that are healing in it. This is a rapid assembly COVID hospital that we were involved with. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. It's a very dense, complex floor plate. On this side, in the U-shape, is the bedroom. The public staff areas in the middle. The back-of-house staff areas to the right. There's a corridor beyond it. But what we did is took this simple shape. We raised the roof and created a clear story that began to wrap around it. And the reason for that is, you remember that all of the sick COVID people, what did we do with them? We put them in hockey arenas. What do hockey arenas have? 0 daylight. What does that do to the people? The sense of time is fundamentally gone. And what happens is, if you look at preemie babies, what's the most important thing for preemie babies when they're neonatal intensive care unit? To be somewhere that has natural light so that their circadian rhythm is in place. The feedback that we've had from this project is extraordinary. Medical workers that say, I go in, high performance doctors that are supposed to be looking after you, and they feel as if their day job is living in a submarine. People that have come back and said their father was probably in his 70s, declined terribly because he didn't know if it was day or night or otherwise. And the same thing with another guy that was trying to heal and recover in an ICU because there's not a stitch of daylight that ties back to just making sense of how your world is. And how is it that we're creating those places for the people that are looking after us, let alone on trying to heal ourselves? So this idea that when you're lying there, you're looking straight out. A window to your side isn't particularly important, but the ability to open your eyes and look straight ahead and to be able to see if a cloud goes in front of the sun, if there's a rainstorm that comes in the morning, that pink light that comes in, or the deep warm colors at the end of the day, to begin to use the space as something that can enhance your health and well-being as a relationship to the environments We create, just very quickly, this is the world's first cross-laminated timber block. It's being produced in Markham right now in New Brunswick. It's made from little sticks of wood. It can be used from off-cut pieces from mills that have zero value, plus the east coast of Canada and in fact into the United States. A lot of the wood isn't very good because it rolls and cross-laminated. This system can take these things that have very little value that go into pulp and make them into a building block. And so it's mass produced without glue, mechanically fastened with this thing, sticky metal. In fact, it's called sharp metal in the Rotoblast catalog. They've licensed Canadian innovation. It's been licensed globally. It's like a sticky metal. But what it does is creates a block that is absolute precision. It has the environmental qualities of a CLT. It has the strength of a concrete block, but it doesn't need any skilled labor to assemble it. You know, all those cafe TO, you've seen around Toronto, these have been built with this block system. We talk about being able to take buildings down and put them up again. When we started COVID, we just finished the prototype of it. We built walls in school to divide them. We took the blocks down after they put them in the cafe TO for the first year, the second year, and now they're being reused again and again and again and again. So this idea equally that these could be produced in mills in Northern Ontario, and you don't need the skill. You can build your own house, your own garage, you can build anything. So it begins to democratize the way in which we build a Canadian product as a result of it. But this is really the why of what we're doing in the sense of using the architecture to do something as a result of how it relates to our mind, that it then has physiological and psychological impacts of what and how we create. I just want to leave you with a couple thoughts around this idea that there is no such thing as neutral space. What we create is either an accelerant for health or it works against your physiological and your mind health. This idea that all of the environments have a significant impact on both our physiological and psychological health. I mean, we hear a lot about these things about preventative medicine. You know, the analogy of that is that there is a river and people are falling into the river and drowning. So what do? We put up a fence. But shouldn't we be teaching people how to swim, to use the things we create to enhance what we do as opposed to just stopping bad things from happening? Be able to use the environment as an accelerant to stimulate our memory, our learning, our empathy, which we need a lot of these days, emotions and social interaction. To use these spaces to feed us as non-invasive therapeutic treatments, architectural supervitamins that feed every part of your body. Why is this important? For one reason, to create the conditions of which we can thrive and flourish to deal with a lot of the challenging problems that we have in front of us. If you have more interest in that, University of Toronto Press will publish, this will be available in a month's time. A lot of these ideas, the depth in it, it's got a glossary of terms, 50 books to read. It's got a big, deep bibliography on it, and it goes through all of the issues and has some examples to try and connect the dots between space and performance. If you have any questions or interest or would like to explore, the websites and the other things have a lot of information. If you'd like to reach out to me, please do.
And we have time for a few questions, Ty, as well, if that works. So if anyone wants to ask a question, Ty, before we break for lunch. There's one person over there, I think. Right up there in the black shirt.
I want to ask about finishing material and wood. So is there a difference between whole log wood,
Yeah, like the interesting thing for me is a lot of the things that we deal with is more of a visual environment in regards to our senses. And we don't focus on a lot of the other elements. For example, when you design a building, I mean, we look very carefully at what it looks like. We only look at it a little bit around acoustics, assuming it's something that we're worrying about reverberations. I mean, when was the last time you designed the scent of your building? Scent for wood is extraordinary. If you look at the data, different types of wood, for example, it's amazing on what it does to reduce heart rate, blood pressure. As a result of it, think of going into a sauna and cedar and smelling that, it has a significant impact. There's Norwegian studies and a Swedish study that begins to look specifically at that. Acoustics is another thing, depending on how the wood is, how it's treated or finished or otherwise. The sound, I mean, we don't deal a lot with that from a design standpoint. But again, it ties back to performance. And that's just not the bad side of sound, being the noise, but the sound side of it, which is in fact something that does a lot to a whole lot of psychological and physiological aspects of it. So there's a Norwegian and a Swedish study that send me a message, I can share it with you.
So I totally agree.
Totally agree with what you're saying here. I really see the value. And obviously schools will see the value because you've talked about schools. But what about the broader developers? Do they see the value that you're communicating here?
Well, I think, I don't know the name. What's the office building over here that's mass timber, T3? What is it, Hines, I think, that's doing all of them? Why are they building them? Because they can get higher rents. Because your employees, they feel better, instead of going back to a T-bar ceiling, it creates value. And so I think that's, for me, one of the most compelling things that, if I'm running a business and I've got a couple hundred employees and I can enhance their performance as a result of the environment, does that have value? I mean, we were looking at the embodied carbon on the initial and the life stage, which the half presentation I was amazing. That, and people will argue the percentages is, but that idea that, okay, if you spend $1 on construction, initial capital costs, how many dollars do you spend on the operating systems in the building? Guess. Over the life, whatever that lifespan is, ballpark, $5. But what do you spend in cost, you running your business? What do you spend on human costs over that period? Guess? Anybody? 200. 200. You spend $1, you spend $5 on the operating, and you spend 200 on the other, and I have the ability, by the way we design things, to enhance human performance of your staff, medical outcomes, learning, as a result of what and how we can build. All the buildings I'm showing here, for the most part, are for, at least the health ones, are public clients. They don't have any money. None of them have any money. But how you decide to spend that money to do, I mean, don't get me wrong that the whole ecological environmental aspect is one of those legs of the table that's very important. But we're not designing buildings just because of their carbon. We have a lot of significant challenges out there. How do we bring us together into spaces that we want to spend time together to solve these and to enhance your creativity and your learning and the empathy and all of these other things? And what can we do to enhance that? For us, in the practice, we're laser focused on that issue. Number one thing. The other pieces are very important, but they're becoming a standard of care. We have to shift and begin to look at human performance at this place and this time to help with all the other issues that are out there.
Hi, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the talk. It's really interesting. I guess my question is about sort of human variability with all of this. I remember a conversation many years ago with a friend who, unlike me, was not affected by like kind of the room they were in and their mood. Whereas, so I was making an argument about, I feel like depressed in this room or I feel happy in this room, whatever. He's like, oh, it doesn't matter. Who cares about the room? I don't pay attention to the space. And so I just wonder, are there people, and have there been studies done for like, there are people for whom it maybe really matters, educational context, health context. Are there people, maybe office context, but are there people that it doesn't matter for? Or how do we account for like people who care and people who don't care so much about their surroundings? Or are they don't think about it, but it's still affecting them?
Every space affects everybody, and the problem is that most of the time it affects them on the negative side of it. And so there's fantastic stuff in all kinds of different levels, for everybody. And your point is exactly it, that sometimes it's conscious, sometimes it's subconscious, sometimes it's perceived or it's below the surface. But it changes your physiological aspect. Like every spot you walk into, you either feel excited or encouraged, or you might not feel safe as a result of it. You can imagine those types of places. But every place communicates something to us. This stuff, the elements of enriched environments that we've been working on, they're not prescriptive. The analogy of them is like a spice. And because, like the earlier stuff that I was covering, we all come at it with either cultural or social or other overlays that change our perception. But the analogy in regards to the spice is, think of cinnamon. So cinnamon in Western culture, what's it about? Well, I think of maybe a spiced goose at Christmas, spiced wine. You can think of sort of that period, cultural period, that there's a lot of that. But if you go down to Trinidad and this double, a meat pie that's spiced with cinnamon, or if you look at an Indian biryani, it has cinnamon in it. The cultural aspects of it are all very different on perception, on what I think of the spiced goose and the association with it, or the Indian biryani. But that taste of cinnamon becomes similar. There's a whole variety of other ones in the studies. You look at scents. You can think of sweet things or spicy things on the way we perceive them. Architecture is very similar to that. And so the important thing is not the prescriptive thing, but the idea of understanding what are you trying to achieve. Back to the idea, if we're thinking of our personal relationship, and I'm designing a school for you, what's important? Is it generosity? Is it social interaction? If the building was a person, what would be the qualities and characteristics of it? And what's important about that is we did work in South Africa, health promoting lifestyle centers. We won an international competition to build these across the country. What was curious there for me is that in South Africa, with apartheid, that there was a lot of buildings had a specific vocabulary. So I think, for example, think of Georgian architecture. There might be a pediment, there might be columns and stuff. What does that communicate to me? Well, it might communicate order and government buildings, or maybe stuff like that, stability. But if you're in South Africa or in the deep south of the United States, the white pediment and the columns, specifically in South Africa, begin to communicate oppression and a lot of terrible things that happen. So it's not about having the glass or the Georgian architecture and the pediment. It's what are you trying to create as an environment that's doing something? And then we can begin to understand as a wider group, which gets back to the whole generosity of the design process that has to be co-creation, many voices at the table to explore these. But it's not prescriptive, it's what are we trying to achieve as a result.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. You spoke a little bit about the fractal geometry specifically and its impact. I'm curious if you could speak more about that, and if there are certain geometries that are more impactful, like what the studies are around that.
So it's a fairly recent discovery. We were working with different shapes and forms over time, like that early cancer center. And we sort of knew in our gut that these different shapes and patterns, that there was a sweet spot for them. There's a professor in Oregon, Jackson, I think his name is. He's done some really interesting research, and there's this mid-range fractal pattern that, what does that mean? So think of things that you see that have a pattern that are very simple. What does your mind do? Your mind looks at it, it sums it up. Your brain uses 30% of the energy of your body, wants to be very efficient on predictions. You look at the pattern, you sum it up quickly. A straight corridor, you look at it, you sum it up quickly. If it's a curved corridor, you're curious about what's around it. You can think of things in nature that have a little more complexity to it, and you're interested because you want to figure out what is that. If you look into paintings and other things, it's very, very real on that. Some that are boring, some that are really, really interesting, which gets into this idea of being working on positive ambiguity. What's an example of it? So this guy, Jackson, that interests me a lot, is he started looking at Jackson Pollock paintings. Why do they sell for so much money? Like, why do people want them? He was curious about that. And what he found was that the patterns in the Jackson Pollock paintings were at that mid-range pattern that are very similar to what we experience in nature or nature, Japanese forest bathing, is there is that sweet spot in his paintings that become mesmerizing on the complexity of them, but not too complex that, it's like, I can't figure this out anymore, not boring that you want to move away from. And that was his thesis on why they are so intriguing. And so it's a big focus in our work, is beginning to, in the school with the arches, there's the arches, but it's a curved pattern also, meaning that the way you see the arch turns from a circle to like an ellipse. And then your eye follows the curves, but the triangles, there's a spark, and you stop and you stop. And so beginning to do these things that, or like that exoskeletal structure on that, it has these curves, but also the other. And it's like music, that you have the rhythms and then you have the other pieces, because we want to figure it out. It's like space is a gymnasium for your mind. And so to be able to work that, to create spaces that we feel sort of curious.
Ty, thank you so much. We're going to wrap for lunch now, but if anyone has more questions, they can come up and talk to Ty. He'll be here for the day as well. We're now going to break for lunch and come back for 1:30 when we'll begin again with Franco Piva and all the other exciting speakers for this afternoon.